This weekend we're going to cover 4 knowledge areas. It's going to be a lot to absorb. I'll do my best to tell you stories that will help you relate to it so that as we move through, you don't get lost too easily. For those of you that are doing ECBA, this might feel overwhelming this weekend. If last weekend didn't, this weekend may. So please don't give up on it, and just plug away at using your question banks and watching the videos and asking questions and reading the BABOK, and you will be okay, I promise. It's just you're going to need to be patient with yourself and be patient with the process. Those of you that have done this for a while and maybe you're going to CBAP, some of this might be familiar to you from a theoretical standpoint, but I might be calling it completely different things, which can get frustrating and confusing. So just hang in there with me. Again, I will pause. I'll do my best to pause and invite questions, but don't wait for me to do so. Interrupt me. It's okay. I would rather you interrupt me and ask questions that can help the whole group than to not ask questions and then get so lost that it's hard for me to help you. And I do want to help you. Today we're going to cover 2 knowledge areas, and tomorrow we will cover 2 knowledge areas. Today it's going to be requirements lifecycle management, which is not all that exciting. And the second one we'll cover today is strategy analysis, which is my favorite knowledge area. So I'm going to give you some stuff that's not all exciting and some stuff that's really exciting. So hopefully it balances out for you. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I usually try to pause every 50 minutes and give you a 10-minute break because your brain can only take so much information at once. Our goal is to cover all of those 2 knowledge areas today so that we can spend tomorrow covering requirements analysis and design definition and solution evaluation. So without further ado, we will begin talking about requirements lifecycle management unless any of you have any questions about my cadence or my approach. Okay. I try to wait those awkward 5 to 7 seconds of silence. So, okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump straight into requirements lifecycle management. You will see in here there are some these presentations were built primarily by LN, and he has some of his stories built into them, but what I will wind up doing is moving through those stories and telling you my own. And I tell my stories in the middle of everything, and I tend to tell a lot of stories, so so bear with me when I skip some slides. Okay, so requirements lifecycle management. I'm going to ask you guys, from your perspective, you know what project life cycles are and what solution development life cycles. When we're talking about requirements life cycles, do you believe that requirements have lives? Do they survive beyond a project? Okay. Do they end? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. That would end the project. That would end that specific instance of that requirement, but the requirement itself would not die. Getting sign off is just a modification of the stage, right? So it's almost like, okay, the child is your requirement. Let's talk about it like children. The requirement is now an adult, so it's going to move out of your house, and it might come back sometimes and need some help here and there. Sorry, I'm a mom. Yeah, sorry, I'm a mom of a boy, and you're gonna get that in my examples here and there. Um, so it's they everyone needs to have a requirement that's going to be signed off. Now, just because it's been signed off on doesn't mean that we got it perfect and doesn't mean it won't change. So anytime in the process where it's in development or it's in QA or even when it gets into production, at some point along the way, someone could realize that something needs to be changed. But that doesn't mean that requirement is dead. It just means that requirement is changing form a little bit again, right? So when would a requirement die? Let me ask you guys that. What would your perspective be of what would cause a requirement to die? Um, no, so your project, you can call your project done, but the business still has that need, right? The system's just fulfilling it. So a requirement is a representation of the need of the business or the need of a stakeholder. When does that stakeholder not need that anymore? So what do you mean by when it is obsolete? What does that mean to you? Okay. Okay, so the business is changing, the business is maturing, it's evolving, and they don't do things the way they used to do anymore, so they don't need that thing anymore, right? Yep. That's when a requirement dies. Okay, so a requirement dies when it's no when that capability is no longer needed in the organization. So that's where it gets kind of interesting, is recognizing the difference between requirements life cycles and other life cycles. And most environments don't see the requirements as having a life beyond a change initiative, right? So that's where we see the birth of things like Agile and things like that. They just want to get things done really fast and then throw everything away and start fresh the next time. Every sprint is kind of like a fresh thing. You'll use your existing knowledge and stuff, but we don't typically reuse requirements in those worlds. Well, with the IIBA, Agile can work, but at the same time, we go beyond Agile and we go before Agile. So it's where requirements, they have lives of their own. They change throughout the process. They're needed post-implementation. They evolve over time, and eventually they die. They have a longer life cycle than any other life cycle. Requirements have the longest life cycle. They take a lot of vitamins. Okay, so the point of this knowledge area is managing that requirement from the moment it's identified as a potential need, not even a known need, but a potential need, until the organization has moved beyond the behavior or the value delivery that they originally had, right? So it's about managing and ensuring that requirement is healthy and happy all the way through all of that. Um, and the other part that we manage, so that's about managing the requirement itself, right? Is it defined accurately? Does it bring the value expected? Things like that. But also, what does it relate to? Understanding and defining and managing the relationship that requirement has to other requirements. And if we do it right, regardless of the methodology we're using, we can still give attention to the ability to reuse requirements. And we'll get into all of these in more detail. But yes, so maintaining the requirements, but it's important for us to differentiate what that means, right? Most people that I talk to, when I say managing the requirements, they're thinking, I'm going to maintain the priority of the requirement, make sure the requirement's up to date, and I'm going to make sure that it has the right status. That's the level of maintenance that most organizations do. Most organizations that I've worked at, I'm one of the few people that actually does traceability. And given the right tools, it doesn't have to take long. And I'm also one of the few business analysts that wrote my requirements in such a way that they could be easily reused in other projects as well as reused for other purposes. And we'll get into those things. So I want to ensure that we understand with this group that maintaining requirements, it has a bit to it, but we're going to cover what those are. So this only talks about 2 life cycles, but I'm going to talk about 3 life cycles because the business analyst and the project life cycle are not the same. Okay, And that's what's implied here on this slide. So the very first life cycle that starts is the requirements. The requirement gets born, right? Someone realizes I have a need or I have an opportunity that's not being managed or addressed. Okay, well, there we have a requirement that's born. So now we need someone that's going to take care of that requirement. I'm going to engage, ideally, unfortunately, many organizations do not do this. Ideally, I'm going to engage a business analyst right away and say, hey, I have this thing. I think it might be a thing. Can you help me figure out if it's a thing? And then the business analyst gets involved, starts asking doing our root cause, our 5 whys. Why do you need that? Where does that come from? Why do they do that? That kind of stuff. And we eventually uncover what the real true need is, which is very often different than the spoken need that was brought to us. And then we help the organization realize, can we change this? Should it be changed? What's involved? And based on the result of those questions, what is the answer that comes out of those questions tells us if a project gets born. And then the project goes along its way. We're going to assume that a project is born. Project goes along its way. We do all of the normal project activities. Everyone's engaged. We might have vendors. We might have developers. Hopefully we have QA. That's not the BA. And we get to a point where we're delivering something. Post-implementation, everyone does their checks. Everyone does their lessons learned. The project dies. A happy long life the project had, but the project dies. And then if we're doing things best practice and right, the BA still stays engaged, like at post checks. Ideally, we're being proactive and we check 2 or 3 months later. Because in the first few days to a week, we really don't know how well we met the need. We know, does the system function? Does it open up? Does it let people enter data? Does it do the things we expected it to do? That's what the project will check. But the BA should come back post-implementation after a certain period of time and preferably, most of us don't have time to do this, but preferably periodically ongoing, like 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, to make sure, okay, did you uncover any workarounds? Did it really meet your need? Things like that. Eventually, everything's going great consistently, so the BA doesn't have to engage anymore, really. Okay, so the BA life cycle dies, but that requirement stays alive until the business changes their business model, stops selling a specific product, or automates something and they don't have a manual need anymore. So those are the 3 different life cycles we're talking about, okay? Was that clear? It might be a new concept, but did the theory, was that understood? Okay, good. Okay, so here are the 5 tasks we're going to cover. Most of these are not very exciting. We're going to talk about tracing and maintaining the requirements, and then should be easy, but it's not prioritizing. We're going to talk about if something changes, how do we assess the impact of those changes to the requirements that someone's requesting, and getting requirements approved, which should be the easiest task, and it's often takes the longest. So that's it for the introduction. So now we're going to actually start jumping into the tasks while I shift over to the next presentation. You are welcome to ask questions while I'm getting this up. So any questions about the big high level picture of what we're covering? I mean, that's not usually where most of the questions come in. I get it. You're probably going to ask more questions when we get into the weeds, but. Okay, now we're going to talk about tracing requirements. Definitely not fun if you're not using a good tool, but it can be extremely valuable and pay you dividends later. So tracing requirements. We kind of talked about this earlier, so that was kind of cheating, but let me go ahead and ask you, what do you see as tracing requirements? What does that mean to you? Say that one more time, please. I'm sorry. Okay, so what is it related to from what caused it and what does it feed, things like that? Yeah, that's the main traceability we'll talk about. There's also a traceability, so that's like grandparents and children, right? There's also cousins involved, aunts and uncles and things like that. So you can have tracing occur where it's not causational, right? It's just related. And if I change this, it could, but it might not impact these other things. Usually if I have my immediate family is usually going to be the most impacted by change, but it could affect some other things as well. So it's where we look at a requirement and understand how it relates to everything else. Most of the time, you're going to see business requirements, which are the really high level. And if you're talking about Agile, that's the same thing as like an epic. Down into stakeholder requirements, which are similar to user stories. Down into solution requirements, which are functional and non-functional. And those are usually kind of like acceptance and evaluation criteria if you're in Agile. And then to ultimately into solution components, which are things like your screen mockups or your use cases, or tracing it into actually modules of a particular application or technology solution. But there are also things like business rules that you'll link things to. You'll link these things to business processes. So you can link anything to anything. You can trace anything to anything. And it's important that we understand that. The purpose of it is to make sure that we're in alignment. We want to make sure that we understand how things are related to each other so that we can understand potential impact of a change that we might talk about later, right? So we're going to talk about assessing changes. To assess changes, I need to understand how my requirements relate to one another. And the easiest way to do that is if we are maintaining our traceability. So it's where we make sure that we understand how these things are all connected to one another, understanding that web. According to the BABOK, we have three kinds. Okay, so we have backward traceability, which is also often called derivation. So derivation is often, so you can say this is derived from, or this derives into. So derivation can actually be backward and forward. But it usually talks about this comes from that. Forward traceability, you can use this as an allocation. Allocation implies I am going to fulfill this requirement in this specific solution function. So this specific solution capability is going to take care of this need. So I'm allocating this requirement to that solution capability. Allocation, forward traceability can also it can be not allocation. It can be about this requirement causes that requirement. So that's where we come into the derivation. This derives into that, or this causes that. So it can be, forward traceability can be either talking about allocation so that needs are met, or it can be talking about causation. And then we have the relationship to other requirements. Like I mentioned, you could say that these data elements don't cause this report, but it's related to that report because that report uses it, right? So you could do that. Those are the three types of traceability. I know that's high level. We're going to dig a little bit more into that in a little bit. Here is an example of an Excel matrix, and right after this I'll actually ask you if you have questions, unless you want to interrupt. So usually, and I would add a column to this, and I'll explain that to you in a moment. So you have your requirement ID, pretty straightforward, right? You have the high level statement of what the requirement is. You probably actually have a description which has, so this would be title, and then you would have a description that's more wordy, that has a lot more information that people can use. What is your source? Where did it come from? Is it in a use case? It may not be in a use case, because use cases are not a given. We only write use cases when it's appropriate. But here is I'm going to allocate this requirement into this release, right? This is the release I'm going to meet that need in. Now, to see the relationship of true traceability, you would probably add a requirement ID column here that says related requirement ID. And then you're going to have, so manage schedule. That's really high level, right? That's more like an epic or more like a business requirement. So what you're going to want to have is you're going to have, okay, how do I manage the schedule? What are the elements that I need in order to do that? So you're going to have requirement ID 10,001, 2, 3, 4. And so those are all going to, in this related requirement column, they're going to relate back to requirement 10,000. And now I have true traceability. That way, if I decide my managed schedule need is a little different than this, I can actually know all of the requirements associated with it. And not by the requirement ID. It would be by the related requirement ID. Because so I have a system that I'll try to show you before the end of tomorrow. It might get tricky, but I have a tool that I'll try to show you. And these requirements, if I write these first, and I usually do write my business requirements first, it would be 10,000, 10,001, 10,002, 10,003, 4, and 5. And then my detailed stuff for managed schedule would be 10,006 with a related requirement ID of 10,000. For managing defects, I would have an item that states that the solution must provide the user an ability to report a defect with the following fields. That would be my requirement, and it would relate back to, so that would be 10,007 that would have a related requirement ID of 10,001. So I know I'm asking you to visualize some things while you're learning new content, but that's the best I can do right there. So that is a sample traceability matrix. This is probably in Excel, I would expect. Unfortunately, the majority of groups that do this kind of work are the majority of people that do this kind of work are typically going to be using Excel. I have a tool. I have a true requirements management tool that I use. I don't have to use Excel. And when I am creating my requirements, I'll create my business requirement. I'll right click it and I'll say traces into functional requirement or stakeholder requirement, and it'll automatically generate my trace. So I don't have to use this, but many people do. Any questions about why do we do traceability, what's its purpose, and the high-level kinds? We're about to talk about the benefits of it and some more detail. There is not open source. I do have a free tool. There is a tool that is a less robust version of what I use that is free. I think it does some traceability, if I recall correctly, but it doesn't do some of the really cool stuff I do, like business process models and stuff like that. But it does requirements management with use cases and screen mock-ups and some of the things that many business analysts have to use. It does do those. I'll show it to you. I'll actually show it to you before we're done. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about the benefits. First of all, it helps us ensure that we are writing requirements that are necessary. We want to make sure that the solution actually meets the requirements. And so if we trace requirements well and we're starting to allocate these requirements into solution, that's where we're making sure the solution stays on track. It also helps us manage the scope. So if someone says, I want this thing, and I'm saying, okay, so what business requirement does that come from? And if I can't answer that question, it's a very good indication that that's not really a need, it's a want. And then I can challenge that, but it's not me challenging it. It's the traceability controlling the scope. So it no longer becomes about me being the bad guy. It becomes more about data and fact, right? It also helps me manage risk, because if I'm doing good traceability and someone comes to me with a change, I will have a much higher probability of recognizing if that requested change is going to have further reaching impact than I would be aware of otherwise. Because if I don't do traceability, it can get really painful understanding what the up and downstream impact would be of this one change in this one requirement. So it's really good at that. And so if we're managing both of those, that means we're doing really good job at managing the changes that are coming in for requirements, which helps us control cost. And it also gives us a form of communication that's less, it becomes less about it becomes less frustrating. Well, maybe not. It's probably still frustrating for the person that wants it, and you're telling them, "Oh, I'm sorry, that doesn't fit in the scope." But it makes the communication a little less about you being the bad guy and a little bit more about the data is the data is the data, right? And then maybe you got the first part wrong and you have to fix it. But the other thing it helps you do, if you've got these business needs, right, and you don't have functional requirements for a solution that can help you meet that business need, then that means you're missing stuff. And like the tool that I use has these trees that it creates for me. I can go to a section of my tool that's traceability matrices, and it looks like a Visio diagram, and it shows my requirements and it blows it out into everything that's connected to it. If anything is missing a connection, it turns red for me. So I can immediately see if I have a capability that's not being met. That's the value of traceability. You can get that without that cool tool I just described. You know, if you have Excel, you can run a pivot table. You can do some filters. You can do some sorting. You can do some things like that. But traceability itself, the whole idea of traceability, helps us ensure we're doing everything we're supposed to and not doing anything we don't need to do, right? Okay. Um, and this restates what I've already said a little bit. So it helps us with impact analysis. It helps us make sure that we understand if we change this, what else might we need to consider. Helps us make sure we've covered everything, and it allows us to easily allocate requirements into solution components. So I've already said all of those in that first slide. Now we have some elements that we need to talk about. Level of formality. Many organizations are not high in formality when it comes to requirements. So I know a lot of organizations that if they do traceability, it's by accident. The relationships you plan on tracing, and how you're going to store them. So these are the three things we think about when we're trying to decide, are we going to trace? If so, how? How are we going to record it? Where is it going to stay? Things like that. So we want to think, when we're trying to think, okay, how detailed am I going to get doing this tracing work? I need to make sure it's worth it because it's expensive. So I need to use good judgment. So for example, you have a report that's been used for a while. It still serves its function, but I need to add a summative calculation on it. I need to know what the sum is, or what the average is, or what the mean is, or whatever, right? I need a value that's calculated off of all the stuff that's already there. I don't need you to redo the report. I don't need a bunch of change. I just need this one little thing. If I just need this one little thing and it doesn't impact anything else, I probably don't want to go through the trouble of doing traceability, because traceability is not easy. If I am coming into a system that's been around for a while, it's already got a lot of stuff going in it. Nothing has ever been documented before me. Okay? And all I'm doing is a fairly small change. To do traceability correctly would require me to go document all of the related requirements that touch this, even if it's not impacted. Okay, so I could take something that might take a few days into it taking a few weeks. Do you think anyone's going to accept that as a reasonable level of effort? No. People are going to be like, that's where we get our reputation in some organizations as the bottleneck, or as the person that just has to dot every I and cross every single T before they'll let us do anything. So that's bad. But if your organization has decided that they are going to start a whole new line of business and they need a whole new solution for it, and you're starting from scratch and it's going to be involved and is going to impact many departments, would traceability be worth it then? What do you think? I would say yes. I would say that if it's a brand new line of business that we're trying to do, or a brand new product we're trying to build, and we're starting from scratch on it, this is the perfect time to do traceability, because it helps me throughout the entire process and it helps me ensure I haven't missed